There we go. Okay, I'm recording. And here's the share screen. And here's the presentation. Okay, and let's get rid of all these blockages to the presentation here. Okay, see if we can move this down. That's a little better. Okay, so let's do slideshow. Here we are. Okay, so today's focus is on the different components of a research project, what goes into it, and this will help you not only to understand the total research enterprise, but also it'll help you with these assignments that we're going to be doing in class for a while. And it's to help you to be able to complete both the annotated bibliography and the literature review that are the biggest assignments for the class. They have the most points, so they're important projects. So we're going to start out with just an overview of the process. And the process has several components. And first is to select a research topic. So that's what we were working on last class on Tuesday. And that's something that is actually harder than it might seem, because you have to really understand the field to know what you can do to contribute. Then we have the literature review, which reviews all the prior research on the topic. And then we have the selecting of the method. So some people have their favorite methods that they use pretty much most of the time, and some people will change methods here and there, but we'll be talking about methods a little bit today. And then once you've selected your method, then you can actually conduct the research, and then you write the report. While you're conducting research, you document what you're doing, and that makes it easier to write the report afterwards. So that's an overview of the whole process. Now we're going to talk about the specific components. So let's talk about the research report, which is the end product. So the research report is going to start with an introduction, which often has a statement of the problem. And what you're doing with the statement of the problem and the introduction is to try to convince the reader that what you are researching is really important, that you're making a contribution, that you're trying to solve a problem, that what you're doing has ramifications for people outside of just your own research team or your own university. It's something that's going to help the world. So that goes into the statement of the problem, and it also gives context so people understand more about the problem that you're researching. Then you have the literature review, and the literature review covers all the important literature that you need to have looked at, so you are somewhat of an expert before you even start doing the research, that you know what's already been done and not reinvent the wheel. I already mentioned that we have the method. I'm going to give you more information about that. The data is what the information that you collect from administering the method to do the research, and then you analyze that data. And some research reports combine the analysis with the presentation of the data. And then you have the discussion, and in the discussion, you will talk about why it's important, and also talk about what you've discovered, what problem you solved, and then finally are the implications. What are the implications of this research? Okay, so when you're doing your homework this week, you're going to be looking for these different pieces of your research report, and you're going to just write a couple of lines about what you found in each of those sections, so that you can start becoming familiar with the different parts of a research report. So now we're coming to the next, or the very first part of a research project, which is selecting a narrow research topic. So this might seem like it's easy, but as you saw in last class, because some people were having trouble deciding, it's not easy to decide a research topic. When you're first starting out is when it's the hardest, because you don't know anything about the field and what's already been done. Once you've been researching for a while, you usually establish what's known as a research program, and you keep on building the amount of knowledge on that topic that you've decided to focus on. And that's how researchers typically build their career. And after they've done a bunch of research projects, then they might take all that information and put it into a book. So usually the research unfolds one project at a time, and each of those projects gets documented into a research report. And hopefully, if you did a good job, it'll get published in an academic journal, and you might also present it at a conference. Next, I'm sorry. So in order to figure out a topic, one of the ways that people often start out as a researcher is to reflect on problems that they're coming across in their own life. So if you're having problems with meeting people, you could do a research project on how you make connections and get to know people. If you're having a problem with interviewing for jobs, you might want to do research on what are good ways to interview for jobs and so on. So you can think about personal challenges, communication challenges that you're having in your own life. That's one way that people start to pick an idea for a project. Then you might look at what are some of the challenges that you're having at work. Most of us work for a living, and there's lots of different challenges. You could have challenges with your coworkers. You could have challenges with your boss. You could have challenges with the organization. You could have challenges with the way the organization is communicating to the exterior world, so on, right? So these are all things that sometimes bring about a decision on what to do a research project on. Then you might be thinking about problems in your community. There could be problems in your local community. Is there a problem with litter? Is there a problem with healthcare? Is there a problem with the way police treat people and so on, right? What's going on in your local community? You could look at the community as being the university. What are challenges that students have? What are some of the issues that student organizations might have, and so on, right? So that's at the community level. And then some people in communication do research about larger societal challenges. So I know some people were interested in conflict resolution. So what are some major conflicts going on in society today? Or what are the environmental challenges that we're having? So those are some examples of larger societal challenges. A field like health communication could be looking at the need for better communication about healthcare across society and not just at a hospital. So that could be a societal challenge. So all of these are the ways that people will think about a project. What's something that you can do that could be useful? What's something that you can discover? Or what's a problem that you could solve that would be helpful to individuals, to organizations, or to communities or society at large? Okay, so once you've picked a topic, then the next part of the research enterprise is to look at the existing literature. So some of the places that you can look for information for the discipline are the communication journals. So for your literature review, I'm actually having you focus on what you can find in the search engines, and I've asked you to do peer review. So you're going to mostly find journal articles for that, okay? Another place you can find information is in books. Typically, books have two types that are academic. So one is when a person who's been researching for a long time, done a lot of different research projects, compiles it into one book and sort of looks at what they're learning about this phenomenon over time. Another type of book is an anthology or an edited volume that brings together a bunch of different articles by people on a specific topic. So for example, because I've done a lot of gender research and I've seen edited volumes on gender and communication that will look at different types of research that are done on gender and communication, okay? Then another way people get information is to talk to communication researchers. So if you were to read an article and find it really, really interesting and want to learn more, you would want to see what else that person has written. And then if you had questions, you could try to contact that person. And I'll tell you a little more about the journal articles to see how you can do that. And then lastly, you can browse the internet, and sometimes Google searches. In particular, there's a search engine called Google Scholar, which is a good search engine for finding academic literature, research articles, and information about research. And sometimes I watch YouTube videos of professors at other universities who are giving lectures, and sometimes you can find some really good lectures to get information about your topic. Okay, so once you figure out your topic and you've looked at your literature, the literature will help you narrow your focus, okay? So some questions you can ask yourself is, what is your purpose? Why are you doing this research? What do you hope to accomplish? That's one way to narrow your focus. Then the second, you need to make sure that it fits in the communication discipline. Some research questions are answered by communication, and some are answered better by sociology or psychology or political science or some other field. So you have to make sure that the way that you're asking the question actually allows you to look at the communication discipline research, because that's what you want to build on as a communication scholar. One of the ways that you can figure out if you're focusing on communication is to think about, well, what does communication research do? So we talked about that last week, and it's in chapter 1. And typically communication research focuses on the creation or the production of messages, and these could be both verbal or nonverbal. It looks at how people are interpreting those messages, and it looks at the effects of those messages. What do those messages do? Okay, and then also it might look at how the message is being communicated, and what are the channels and so on. Okay, so you want to focus on communication. There's a lot of environmental problems today, and I'm going to use that as an example because a lot of people are interested in sustainability and putting an end to a lot of the unsustainable practices and trying to clean up the environment, right? Well, communication has a lot to offer that. Scientists have a lot to offer in that area, and people who are studying environmental concerns, right? But communication has a lot to offer because how we organize to make changes is done through communication. So that's why we have this area of expertise now of environmental communication. So environmental communication would look at how people communicate, how they create messages, how they create campaigns, how they influence people to change processes, how they put pressure on politicians and so on, right, to try to make the changes that are needed for the environment to improve. So you can find a social problem or organizational problem that might not sound like communication, but if you can figure out a communication angle on it, then you can do it as a communication researcher. And communication is known for solving practical problems. That's one of the great things about our discipline, is that we do solve practical problems. And one of my professors, Robert Craig, wrote an article about how communication is a practical discipline. So we are definitely into solving everyday problems at all different levels, okay? So then the next thing is to figure out your unit of analysis. Your focus could be looking at individuals. So interpersonal communication looks at individuals. Then there's families. So family communication looks at individuals. And so, looks at families, and it comes out of interpersonal communication because you're looking at how individual people and families communicate together. And then you might also look at it as a system, where then it's more like a group. So then we look at communication in groups, all different kinds of groups, from teams to clubs to church groups to student groups to community groups and so on, right? It could be any kind of group. Organizations, they could be for-profit, they could be nonprofit, they could be military, they could be academic. So there's all kinds of organizations, and then communities. And okay. If you're looking at media studies, it might look at societal level of communication. Health communication campaigns will look at societal level and so on. Okay, so you have to make sure that you know how to focus your research question so that you can know what to look for and how to set up your research project. And so move on to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a little more details about conducting the literature review, which we talked about a little bit in class last time because we were looking at how to search for articles, right? And here I want to say a little more about what the literature review is about. A literature review provides the argument for your research questions or your hypothesis by providing a comprehensive survey of your topic of interest. So when you write a research report, you hope it gets published so that you haven't wasted a whole year or however long you spent on this project and then you can't even find a journal to publish it, right? You want it to get published. So you have to prove that it's a worthy project. You have to prove that it's important. So the literature review, what that does is it shows you what's already been done, and then you can see what hasn't been done or what's been left out. Where are there contradictions in the different studies? Where are there maybe holes in the ideas because you've analyzed it and you're saying, well, I'm not so sure about that, right? So you have to analyze. You don't just read the literature to know what's there, but you actually analyze it. And by analyzing it, that helps you figure out what the next study could do to try to keep on making progress in the field of knowledge that you are researching, right? So when you're doing your literature review, you're going to actually be analyzing it. You're going to be putting the articles that you find into groups with common themes or common research methods, and you're going to then summarize what you learned from the different groupings of the articles, and then that will help you then figure out, well, what could be done next to keep on making progress in this research, because that's ultimately the goal of academic research, is to keep on adding to our knowledge, keep on improving what we know. Okay, so you're mainly using journal articles because journal articles are what are known as your primary sources. These are the people that actually do the research. So we don't use a newspaper article because a newspaper writer, a journalist, goes and interviews the person who actually does the research, and they'll read the research so they understand it, and then they'll interview the researchers, but they didn't do the research. You want to get the information straight from the horse's mouth, right? Straight from the person who did the research. So that's why we use scholarly journal articles, and we use the articles that are the reports on the actual research, not what's known as secondary research, which is somebody that compiles other people's research to put it together and to make an analysis of it. Now, secondary research is useful for getting to understand the field or the area of research. So because the people who write books and book chapters that pull together research will give you some summaries, but you still need to look at the primary research, the research that comes straight from the researcher, to do your own analysis. So I've used the books and book chapters where people have done summaries or pulled it all together. Textbooks are an example of a kind of book that summarizes other people's research. A textbook, each chapter is compiling. So you'll see lots and lots of citations when you read textbooks, and you'll sometimes see them quoting people because they're putting together the research for students, right? That's what the textbooks are. But now what we're doing is we're going straight to those sources that the textbook writers rely on and putting together our own compilation and our own critical analysis of all of this, okay? So you can look at books or book chapters or secondary sources. There's a kind of research or a kind of article that you could find in a journal that's called a meta-analysis, which is analysis of the studies, which those can be very, very useful because they're putting them into categories. So they're a kind of literature study. They study the literature that's been written on the research. And we'll look at some of those too. Those are very helpful, but you have to go directly to the actual primary sources to do the literature review, as well as maybe looking at some of these other compilations of other people's research. All right, then. So here's some more information. Okay, so we started doing this in class on Tuesday, and one of the biggest challenges is trying to figure out what's the key words, because if you haven't read this literature before, it's hard to know what are the key words that are used. So what we did in class was put in some of the topics that are broad topics, and then when you pull up a study, then on on that search engine webpage, they will have the keywords that were used for the study. So that's a really useful thing to see on that webpage, where what were the keywords, and then you can start using those keywords to do more searches. So in the beginning, it's challenging trying to figure out those keywords. And I think there's an example in the textbook where it's kind of like a broad question. So if you wanted to know, let's say you wanted to know how to get along better with people, right? If you put in the words get along better with people into a search engine, you're probably not going to get any academic literature on that, right? That's not what a person would call their kind of research. So you'd have to figure out, well, when we say get along better, what are we talking about? Are we talking about cooperation? Let's see if there's any research on cooperation. Are we talking about conflict resolution, people that can resolve conflicts? Let's look up conflict resolution and so on, right? So you got to initially, you take some guesses and see if you get any hits. But if you can't find them, you can talk to me, your professor, or you can talk to librarians to try to figure out some keywords. Then once you get a few articles, it just gets easier and easier because you'll have lots of keywords, and that helps you. Okay. Sometimes if you narrowly define what you're researching, you can't find any articles on it, or you only find one or two articles. So you may need to broaden what you're looking at so that you can cast a wider net. And you might have to look at the topic more broadly to be able to see what the research is, what research is already done. So it's a combination of figuring out the keywords and then figuring out how to narrow what you're doing so you don't get too many hits, right? So if you put in interpersonal communication, you'll probably get thousands and thousands of hits because there's so many different kinds of studies on interpersonal communication. But if we look at something like relationship development or relationship dissolution or marital satisfaction, right? So you start to see what are the different areas that people in interpersonal communication are researching, and then you start to get then you'll start to get more narrow and get more specific about what you're looking for. Okay, now if your study has already been done, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't study it as well. One of the things you can do is to see how the person did the study, and you can also look at the results and see what might be missing. And sometimes people see a study and figure out that, well, they did interviews, but they never actually observed people doing this. Or they observe people, but they never actually interview them to find out what's going on for them and what does it mean to them. Or maybe they just did interviews of a small population, and now you want to do surveys of thousands of people so you can do more generalization of it, you see? So depending on what you find, you can get ideas about how to build on what's already there. You don't have to throw out an idea just because there's already been research on it. That's actually a good thing to find research. But the thing is to see how can you add to the knowledge. So what you find is very, very helpful. I call it the springboard for your own study. Triangulation is when you use a combination of methods, and some people do that in one study, but you can think of yourself as doing that by using a different method than what other people have done to try to figure out some information, okay? One of my classmates, Laurel Gossett, is now one of the foremost experts on temporary workers. And when she first started researching this she was doing temp work in the summer, so she used her own personal interest to figure out something to do so that she could do some research in grad school. So she did that. When she started reviewing the literature, what she discovered was that the people that did studies using quantitative methods found that people were very dissatisfied doing temp work. But when she looked at studies that were qualitative, she found that a lot of people were very satisfied doing temp work. So she decided to try to resolve that contradiction. And so that's what she did. She ended up doing her dissertation on that. And so what she found out was that whether or not people were satisfied depended on whether or not they were relying on the temp work as their sole way of making a living, and they were doing temp work in things that were their occupational identity, or if people were doing temp work as a way to enable them to do something else that they were more passionate about. So, for example, there's a lot of performers that will do temp work in between gigs, because when you're a performer, you're typically not working all the time, right? The more famous you are, the more you're working on a steady basis. But when you're first starting out in the performance arts, whether it's music or acting or other kinds of things, dancing, right, you're usually doing gig work. So if you can do temp work that fits with your schedule, you could be very, very satisfied. So you see how she found this research had been done. She found contradictions, and then that actually gave her an idea for her own study, and she brought more information to that field. Okay, so so those are some things about the literature review. That, the challenge is initially just finding the search words and then not being too narrow, but finding the correct way to define what you're looking at, and then using what you find as a springboard for generating your own research project. Okay, so that's what the gaps are: things that are not answered. They're areas that have not been investigated. I'll give you an example from my own research. I was very much interested in gender and communication, and I was interested in how women interact with each other. And I found out that there was in the beginning of the gender research, there was a lot of research that was done on white women that generalized to all women. And then people that were from different racial or ethnic groups were saying, hey, that might be true for white women, but that's not true for us, right? So that started to bring about more research on specific races, specific identity groups, research on African American women, research on Latino women, research on Asian women, and so on, right? Research also across different class, social class, right? A lot of the research that had been done in the beginning was on middle and upper class white women. So now the research started to get more specific to other groupings instead of generalizing to all women, right? So looking at that literature, I found a gap, which is that, well, what happens when you bring people from different identity groups together? And in California, especially, we are such a diverse geographical region that usually in any organization, you're going to be interacting with people from different groups. So I use that in my research to see, well, what happens when women from different identity groups are interacting. And what I found that there was some identity conflict, and then looked at what were the strategies that people were using to try to manage, and also to develop and enrich their relationships, right? So I found a gap in the literature, and then I found a way to add to knowledge by looking at women interacting across differences within one group. Okay, so that's how you you find literature, and that's how you use it to build your own research project. Okay. So inconsistencies and contradictory findings, like I said, with Laurel Gossett's research, that's gold. That helps you establish the need for your research. So that goes right into your statement of the problem and your justification for the study. So that's a wonderful thing to find out. Okay. All right, so now we're going to look at the types of research reports. And so if you're working for a private company or even for an organization that's a nonprofit, right, but you're doing the research for that company, it's proprietary. So that means that your research isn't going to get shared with anyone else unless you have permission from that organization. So that's one of the downsides of doing that kind of research is if you find out something that could be really significant for other people, you're not allowed to share it, you're not allowed to publish it, but it helps that organization that you're doing the research for, okay? Then we have working papers. So working papers are when you're trying to figure out how to solve a particular problem, or some organization it has a challenge and they want you to do a little bit of research to help them, and then you can write a working paper. Now, some organizations will let you publish working papers, and consultants that do research on practical problems for organizations will often write working papers, and they will put them on their website so other people can look at them, and it shows off their expertise, which could help them get more work, right? And it can also help other people solve similar types of problems. Okay, so they're kind of in progress while you're doing research, and you uncover problems and you might find solutions. Then you have conference papers. So once you've done a study and you have the data and you've analyzed it and you write it up in a preliminary form, you can take it to a conference and present it. You have to submit your conference paper to the conference organizers, and so it has to be a good enough paper to get accepted. But they do accept thousands of papers, and there's a lot of different, or not a lot, but several different conferences that give you opportunities. So in the US, we have the National Communication Association, that's every year. We have on the West Coast, the Western Communication Association. Then there's a central one in the Midwest, and then there's the Eastern one. Okay, and and there's a Southern Communication Conference as well. So those are 5 large conferences, 4 regional and 1 national in the United States. And then there's the International Communication Association that meets in different countries every year and brings together scholars from all over the world. So because there's lots of people and it's all over the world, it's more competitive to get your papers accepted at International Communication Association. And then same thing with the National Communication Association, is more competitive than Western. Okay, or Southern or Eastern and so on, right? So conference papers are great for researchers to share information. So people go to conferences to both present and to go listen to other people present and learn what kind of research is happening in universities across the country. And there are also some consultants and private, proprietary researchers that come to these conferences too from time to time. It's a great experience if you want to go to the Western Communication Association. They have a student conference that is the day before their regular conference with all the professional researchers, and I highly recommend it. And if you write a paper by next December, you could submit it and maybe present your paper at the Western Communication Student Conference. So in addition to your conference papers, there could be short, brief research notes to give progress reports. People will do that for if their project is being funded and the people who are funding you want to know about the progress. So you will present those kind of papers to your funders, or you may use them at your university because you need to show progress on your research to retain a job as a tenure track professor. Okay. Now the scholarly journals, see, I put that in a different color that contrasts with the background to make it really bright, to stand out, because this is the gold standard. What you want to do if you are an academic researcher is you want your articles published in the peer-reviewed journals of the discipline. That shows that you are respected by the top people in the field and that you are now making a contribution and also becoming one of the experts in the discipline. So that's your ideal, is to get published in a journal. And they're the people that review the journals that decide who gets to have their articles published are called the editors of the journal. And the editors are people who are very well established, who have a very impressive publication record. They have done a lot of studies and they have published a lot of articles. So they're seen as the experts in the field. And only once you've attained that kind of knowledge and that status in the field could you become one of the reviewers that that decides who gets published and who doesn't. And it's very common to get your first submission of an article rejected, and they will write revise and resubmit if they think it does have potential, and then you have to revise your article. They'll give you some notes about how to do that, and then you can try to rewrite it and resubmit. But not every journal article is going to get accepted, or every article, because if it doesn't get accepted, it's not a journal article, right? So not every research report will get accepted. It's very competitive because there's not as many journals as there are researchers, okay? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of researchers just in the United States alone, and there's just not that many journals, okay? Then you have, in addition to the journal article, you can have a book chapter and edited volume. Now, if it's you could actually have a pretty good research article that goes into an edited volume that's a bunch of different research reports. It's usually not as difficult to get published into one of those edited volumes as it is to get published in a journal. But some of these books have really, really excellent research in them, and they're acceptable for for being viewed as a competent researcher at universities. So if you have book chapters, and if you edit a book and collect different articles from your colleagues, that is viewed as being credible research at a university, and you can put it in your resume, and it'll help your career. And I have found a lot of books like this to be very useful for getting information for my research. One of my colleagues, who was a professor when I was still a grad student, did work on groups, and he had just compiled a bunch of articles and was getting ready to publish a book about groups, called a kind of group that it's called naturalistic group, which means it's a group that exists out there in society. It's not just a group that a researcher pulled together into a lab to watch how people in groups interact. It's going out to the field and watching people interact. It's called a naturalistic group. So he had just pulled together a bunch of articles, and there was very, very little research on that. And so I talked to him, and he actually gave me a copy of all those articles before the book got published. And I was able to use those in my literature review, and it really, really helped me with my dissertation. So those kinds of books can be extremely helpful for your research, edited book chapters. And so, if journal articles are number one, I would say these kinds of articles are number two in the world of academia, where they, measure these kinds of things and make decisions about whether people get to keep their jobs at universities and whether people get tenure and promotion and things like that. Okay, now we're moving on to the different types of reports. So the first one is the quantitative research report. So quantitative research reports are reports that collect a lot of information and then use statistics to analyze them, okay? So the different parts of it are, one is the title. So the title of an article has to be carefully chosen so that when people are doing searches, when they see that title, they're going to have an idea of what your article is about, and that will help them make a decision whether to include your article in what they read or to, not read it. So the title is really important, and that's at the top. It's really important. After the title is what's called the byline. So the byline lists the authors, and it tells you what university that they work with or organization if they're not university researchers, and it'll give you contact information, usually an email. So this is really great if you read the article and then you read some other articles by this researcher and then you have some questions. And an example is last summer, I was doing some research on college student conflict, and I came across this article that said that people who studied music for 10 or more years are better at handling conflict than people who didn't study music. And I thought that, wow, that's so interesting. I wonder why, so I read it. And then after I read it, I had some questions about the actual research. And so I sent an email to the researcher, and he was excited that I read his article, and he wrote me back, and then we had a series of exchanges. So it turns out that people who studied music, they are more attuned to the changes in people's voices because they can really hear pitch, and they can hear the subtle differences that voices go through. So when people are in conflict, their voice changes, and people who've studied music will be more alert to that and could start responding to it earlier than a person that's kind of oblivious to the fact that a person's voice is changing, which means that they're getting some emotions that indicate conflict, right? So I thought that was just so interesting. So that byline allowed me to contact this researcher. So that's one of the benefits of having it. Next, we have the abstract. Okay, so the abstract is a summary of what's in the article. It includes the methods, it includes the population that was studied, how the information was gathered, how it was analyzed, and then the conclusions that they reached with that research. So you're going to be collecting these abstracts to get an idea of what the different researchers have done, and it gives you more information than the title does by itself, and then it helps you make a decision whether or not to include the article. And they're really, really helpful. You can get an understanding of a field just from reading the abstracts alone. So you'll be you'll have an assignment where you're focusing on the abstracts, and then for the annotated bibliography, you're basically going to be producing your own abstracts of the articles, which should be different than the actual abstracts. I don't want you to just copy the abstract for the annotated bibliography. I want you to actually write your own. So the abstract's a really important piece of the report. And then you have the introduction, which tells you about the issue or the problem, and tells you the significance of it, right? So why is this important? So the introduction should really grab people's attention and let people see how important what they're doing is, so that people would want to read the article. And then they'll describe the methods. So in the methods section, it's going to tell you whether they are quantitative, qualitative. It's going to tell you if they did surveys, interviews, experiments, observations, field research. So these are the basic usually methods, or if they did textual analysis, if it was some kind of media study, did they analyze newspapers, did they analyze films, or nonverbal, they could be compiling billboards, or they could be looking at signs at a protest, right? What kind of signs are people carrying at a protest? They could be looking at media, they could be looking at the pictures that people post on social media, and so on, right? So these are all different things that people could be analyzing, and so that's the method that they use to get that information. Then they'll tell you how they also analyze that, and they'll tell you they should tell you details about how they got their participants or they got their information, and so on, right? So those are some of the things that are in the method section. And then you have the results or the documentation of the data, right? So after people establish their method, then they're going to tell you what they actually did, how they collected their data, then they'll tell you about how they analyzed it. Now, sometimes the results will include some analysis with the results. Sometimes they save the analysis for the discussion, okay? And so they'll be discussing, what did they find? What does this mean? What are the implications? How can it be used? And so on. And then the conclusion will summarize all of that and make a concluding remark. And then sometimes they write implications. So now that we know this fact, what are the implications for groups, for society, for individuals? And then they'll often also point out what they weren't able to figure out as a basis for people doing further research. So that's often in the implications, or it could be in the conclusion, like what more do we need to do to learn more and understand this phenomenon more deeply or broadly, okay? All right, so that's what goes into a quantitative report. And then the last is the references, what you might know as the bibliography, right? So that lists all of the references. We're going to be using APA in this class, American Psychological Association guidelines, not MLA, the Modern Literature Association, not Chicago style or anything. We use APA because that's what most of the people in the communication discipline use. Basically, there's just media studies scholars that use MLA and everybody else uses APA. Okay. Next, we have the qualitative research report. So a qualitative research report could be interviews. It could be going out in the field and observing people. It could be analyzing text, like looking at newspaper articles, or it could be watching movies. And qualitative is different than quantitative because you're not looking to analyze the frequency, the numbers that you're getting, but just looking at the qualities of what it is you're observing and looking, and you find patterns and categories, and you might find reasons why people are doing things, and so on. So you just basically, you can describe, and then you can also analyze and break that down, what's going on, but you're not interested in the frequency of it, which is, or how widespread it is, which is what quantitative researchers look at. So because of the publishing constraints for basically for journal articles, right, they want to be able to fit in a substantial number of articles into one journal, right? You have to be able to try to break your discussion of what you found into the same kind of form as a quantitative research report. So you still have the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion, and the references, right? That goes into the qualitative, just like it does in the quantitative. But the way that you write about it may differ depending on the choices of the researcher, okay? So sometimes the way that people want to write it up will be more literary. It'll seem more like you're writing a novel than that you're writing a research, like a scientific report with very objective language. So it could be written up with more subjective kinds of descriptions to evoke experiences. And the introduction will include a discussion of the merits of the community or the setting of interest. Okay, so that's usually going to talk about, like, I studied the Boulder Mountain women. So I looked at, I explained why they were significant, why they were important, because they were a women's group during a time where there was still a lot of sexism in the world of outdoor sports. And these women were resisting the sexism and trying to empower themselves in a world where there was a lot of sexism, right? So that's why it was important to look at how are women able to empower themselves and resist some of the patriarchal practices that exist in the world. So that's what I put in my introduction. Whoops, I don't want to, I just want to do this. Okay, so the research questions will often be more general than a quantitative, especially when they're doing quantitative studies often have a hypothesis, and they're either going to prove the hypothesis true or not true. So it's a very specific kind of question. The qualitative will ask how and why and what happened, and be a lot broader than the quantitative studies. So we'll be looking more at quantitative versus qualitative in class. So you'll see those differences more later in the semester. Okay. And then the results in the discussion are often integrated. So as you're talking about what happened, especially like if you're out there doing participatory observation, where you're out in the field and you're watching people interact, and then you're writing about it, you're not going to divide up saying like, well, here's the transcript of the conversation, and now here's what it means. you're actually going to be writing about the two things together. You're going to be discussing the meaning of it as you're describing the actual findings. And then it's written in a narrative form, so it doesn't usually have graphs or tables and things like that the way that a quantitative report does, because it's not just displaying a bunch of numbers. It's just looking at what people say and what they do. And that's why it's a narrative. Narrative is another word for story. So it's displaying stories. And that's their data, is the stories that get collected, right? So there was an anthropologist named Van Manen that worked at MIT. He was a professor at MIT that wrote about the 3 different styles of writing that people use when they do ethnographic writing, which is the kind of report where people go out in the field and observe people and then tell people what they've discovered, right? So the first kind of, so narrative tale is just another way to say stories, okay? So one is what he called the realist tale, where people do try to sound objective and they want everything to be very realistic, and they're sounding like more like scientists than they are like the novelists, okay? So that's the realist tale. And they don't talk about their feelings and they don't talk about their own personal experiences. They tend to just look at the people that they're observing and write about them in an objective way, like they're standing outside looking at these people and making observations and writing about it, okay? So that's the realist tale, and that was the tradition in anthropology and then sociology and then communication, to just observe and then write down realistically what you actually saw and try to use objective language and provide a lot of data to prove your point, okay? Then as people were writing, doing these reports, sometimes they would have feelings about what they were doing and think that would be of interest to people as well. And sometimes they would have dilemmas and they'd find challenges and they wanted to write about those things. And sometimes maybe they even felt a little guilty about what they were doing. So then there's another kind of article, and you'll see a lot of these in anthropology, called the confessional tale, where people will talk about their personal experiences, their challenges, and their feelings that emerge. So they're confessing things that traditionally researchers didn't want people to know because they want them to be seen as objective and rational, right? But we're all human beings and we're doing this research, and sometimes these experiences that we have as human beings out in the field are also interesting and something that we can all learn from. So they'll confess about what they've done. So an example that I have of that was a colleague who's a senior colleague. She's a very established ethnographic researcher. She started in sociology, and when she was doing her dissertation, she was working in a fishing village on the Chesapeake Bay, and the people were lower working class, not really educated. And she got to know them and she formed relationships with them, and they trusted her, especially the women. So the women started telling them about their sex lives. And one of her professors said, "Oh my goodness, this is incredible. This is like gold. You've struck the big gold mine here. You need to just get in there and dig and learn everything you can about their sexual practices, because it's so hard to learn about a community's sexual practices." And what she found out is that when they were teenagers, guys just started basically assaulting them and then having sex with them, and that was their introduction to sex. And she wrote about it. So her professor had kind of pushed her to do it, but then another professor who had seen her story and knew these people got really upset that she had disclosed things in her research report that he thought were making these people look bad, and it was just ethically wrong for her to have done that. So what he did was he went out to this community, because he knew them too. He had done research on them, and he read them passages from her dissertation that really, really upset the women, and they felt betrayed. They felt that their confidence had been betrayed. Now, if that professor hadn't gone out there and read that to them, it's unlikely they would have ever found out, because it's not a community that would have gone to the library to go read a dissertation. And typically when you finish writing a dissertation, you don't make copies and give it to everybody that you interviewed. I mean, that was a huge number of, that would be a huge number of dissertations to have to, to publish, and they're expensive to publish. So you usually don't, and you tell people about it, but they can go look it up. So those people probably never have looked it up and seen that. But when they saw that, they were so upset, and they didn't, their name was never revealed. The individual names of the people was never revealed. The name of the community was never revealed. It was just a fisher community in the Chesapeake Bay, right? But those people, when they saw their words on the page, they got really upset. So she wrote an article called The Ethical Quagmire, talking about how challenging it can be when you're working with the group and you're a part of it. And she actually made an ethical decision at that point in her career to stop writing about other people. And she just decided she was going to start writing about her own experiences. So she does something called autoethnography. That's a new kind of research now that's getting more widely accepted, so that she doesn't use other people for information or, potentially make them feel bad. Okay, so that was a confessional tale. It became a very important article for people who do ethnographic research to realize the effects that they can have on people. So it's great. It's a morality tale, right? It teaches us something. So confessional tales can be very helpful for our knowledge as well. And then the last is called the impressionist tale. So these are written typically as often like a whole book, where you are reading about what the researcher went through, and it's like you're reading an adventure novel. An example of that is a book that's called Between Gay and Straight. And one of my colleagues became friends with some men on a gay men's softball team near where she lived in Florida. And she met them through her husband, because her husband worked with one of these guys, and they invited her husband to be on the softball team because they were short a player. And he was like, yeah, I'm confident in my my masculinity. I'll play with you guys. And so they all became friends. And then she was blown away because she'd never ever met gay people before, and she never hung out with them. And this was her first experience of hanging around with gay men, and she mostly had a really great time. There were a few things she was critical about, but there was just a lot of adventure, and it was all new to her. It was like going to another country and discovering all these things and learning about their challenges of being gay, and how they were rejected by their families, rejected by people, how careful they were about managing their identity so people wouldn't find out. So she just learned so much. And she wrote it. When you read this book, it's like an adventure novel. And when I teach my gender class, I often have my students read this book, and they love this book. They like this book so much that I've had the writer, her name is Lisa Tillman Healy, and she's been a guest speaker in my classes on Zoom because students love this book so much, right? So that's how some people write up their research, like it's a story. So to be a writer that writes impressionist tales, you have to be a really good writer using the kinds of literary devices that a good novelist writes. So, but that is a kind of writing that is becoming more popular in communication studies. A couple of the other people who have written some great books in this genre, they're not alive anymore. One of them is Nick Trujillo, and the other one was Buddy Goodall, and they wrote some really great books too. Okay, so qualitative research can be more scientific and objective, like a realist tale, but it can also be more like reading a novel or a memoir. Okay, so next we have reading the research reports. So when you're doing your annotated bibliography, and when you're doing your literature review, you are going to use some criteria that I will go over in class to evaluate the material. Okay, so you evaluate studies using criteria that are appropriate to the way of knowing, that's that's being presented or positioned in the report, right? So if you're evaluating a quantitative research article, you're going to use the criteria for evaluating quantitative research articles. If you're looking at a book like Lisa's book, Between Gay and Straight, that's written more like a novel, you're going to use a criteria for evaluating that kind of writing. So you're not going to trash Lisa's book because you can't generalize it to a population the way you do with quantitative research. And if you're evaluating the quantitative research, you're not going to trash it because it doesn't sound as exciting and fun as reading Lisa's book, right? So you're going to use a criteria that's used for that particular type of research to make your evaluations. And you want to avoid rejecting a study's findings because the study wasn't perfect, because there is no such thing as a perfect study. So the better you get at analyzing research, the more you will find flaws with it. It may be challenging. This is your first semester of doing this to actually see anything that's a problem with the study. You might not find anything wrong with it. And, when I was in grad school, we even had trouble finding flaws with studies. And a lot of times we would just keep on repeating things like, oh, it has a white Western male bias, because a lot of the research did. And then, or we'd say, oh, they're just used college students for their experiments, which a lot of professors, they recruit students and give them extra credit. And so there's lots and lots of studies on college students. And how do you know that that's going to be true for people that are older, people who are working, people in different contexts, right? So that's like two kinds of criticism that you can often find, is that they have a limited population, but we want to look for other things too that maybe are missing. And that doesn't mean it was a bad study. It just means that nobody's perfect and nobody can see everything there is to find out about any particular phenomenon, right? It's all a process. Okay, and then we want to avoid confusing form with substance. So quantitative and qualitative reports will look different, but both will be rigorous and scientific in their own way. So I remember when I was just learning, when I just started my master's in communication at San Francisco State, I went to a party with a bunch of Stanford students that were doing quantitative information and quantitative research. And so as we were talking, they started telling me how invalid my kind of research was. And it was really, it was kind of hurtful. And we, it was not a very fun conversation to have at a party, but some people get so attached to the research methods and they think it's the only right way to do things. There's actually people that combine methods that do great research. So I would say just be open to all different kinds, but everyone chooses the kind that they appreciate and the kind that maybe they're better at doing, because we all have our personal preferences. So you can have your personal preferences, but be open to reading other kinds of research and learning from it. Okay. Okay. So to determine your purpose, there's a different type, there's different things that people try to do with their research. So one is to just explore and try to understand a phenomena that hasn't been researched very much before. Okay. Just learning and kind of documenting what you see when you explore it. Another is to do description, and sometimes exploration and description go together, but you try to describe in detail what you're learning from what you're studying. And then another is causal and functional explanation. So quantitative research is usually trying to establish causes and look at how things function, and also laboratory experiments, or even what you call quasi-experimental, like an experiment that's done out in the field. An example of, I was involved with a major national quasi-experimental study where we were trying to see the impacts of doing conflict resolution programs in schools. And we also wanted to see the difference between training just one group of students to be mediators, and typically schools will train 25 kids to be mediators. And we wanted to see what that would do the school's culture and to discipline and other kinds of, and climate. We wanted to see a difference between just training a group of school mediators to with what if the teachers taught all the kids conflict resolution in the classrooms. So we would compare those two things. And also we compared it against schools that did not have any kind of conflict resolution training at all. So we collected the same data. We did surveys. We kept administering surveys every like few weeks. We administered surveys to the students to try to track their conflict resolution behavior and then make comparisons. So at the end, we did find there were some differences. And then, that got written up and became an important study for helping to prove that teaching students conflict resolution skills can really help, and it helps schools because it improves their climate, and then there's less disciplinary actions. Okay, so that's causal. So the cause of or a function of conflict resolution training is to help people be better at managing conflict, right? So we helped to prove that with our study, and it's quasi-experimental because we actually did it out in the field with schools that were operating. We didn't pull kids out into a special group on a college campus and just train them, right? We did all of this in the actual situation where the people live and work. Okay, so that's a quasi-experimental. Experimental, you get people in a lab to do something. Okay, and then we have another goal is to just understand. So interviews a lot of times are aimed at trying to understand why people do things. Okay, surveys can do that too, and if they're qualitative surveys, you can try to get more understanding about what's behind what people are doing, right? So you typically have to interact with people to understand how they're interpreting, how they're making choices, and so on. Okay, so those are the major kinds of purposes that people have in their research. And then the next thing is that you have to determine what your unit of analysis is. So are you going to study individuals? Are you going to study groups? Are you going to study organizations? Are you going to study social artifacts? So example is looking at memes. Okay, that would be a social artifact. Okay, so those are the things. Those are the four: individuals, groups, organizations, social artifacts. Media messages, movies, things like that, social artifacts. So these are typically the units of analysis for communication studies. And then we have this part I'm not going to go over right now. I'm going to stop here and see if you have any questions, because we're going to get into that later on in the semester. Okay, so let's see now if anyone has any questions. Okay, so do you have any questions about anything that I talked about today? Anything at all?
I don't have a question, but it's more like a
No questions?
like an
Oh,
opinion.
okay. Well, that's good. I
So
hope that means you understood what I was talking about. And
definitely.
so heads up, there'll be a homework assignment where you're going to have to find an article and find parts of it that we talked about today. So I put the PDF of this chapter 2 into the modules, and then I'm going to post the homework assignment so you can pull out parts of a journal article, so to make sure that you understand all these different things that we talked about today. Okay, and all of this is building towards you doing the annotated bibliography and then the literature review, which will be your major project for the semester. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, then we could end just a couple of minutes early today. And hopefully I'll see everybody on Tuesday, where we get to use some of this information some more in class. Okay, so have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Bye-bye.
I have a just really quick general question.